Hello, everyone. So we're moving on to our next talk. Our next speaker is Robert Kori Golding. He's a co-founder and lead game designer at Albedo Informatics. And it's a Toronto-based development studio with a focus on location-based augmented reality experiences. He's currently developing Sigil, a location-based AR game that brings myths, folklore, and local legends to life. Please welcome Robert.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for showing up. Anyway, I don't know how close I need to get to this mic, so just give me a second. All right, so my talk is on pushing story or crafting narrative and location-based games. Thanks, Chris, for giving a background on me. But basically, I've been designing location-based games for the past 15 years. My first location-based game was for the Motorola Razr, if anyone can remember that. And actually, that was pre-GPS and phones. It was actually a proximity-based game that used Bluetooth to connect people. And anyhow, and after that, we built it out for the BlackBerry Curve with support from the Canada Media Fund. And the game was called Echelon, and it was a conspiracy-themed game. So anyway, I've been designing location-based games and experiences for about 15 years. And generally, right now, my company's focused on location-based augmented reality, so the platform we use is mobile. And I guess I can get into some technical details later. That's in a couple slides. So as Chris said, I'm currently working on a game called Sigil. And Sigil is kind of like the culmination of, it was the game that I wanted to build when I first got into this, making games for mobile, but the technology just didn't exist yet. And it still doesn't quite, but it's getting there. So basically, are you familiar with Pokemon Go? Yeah, anyone? Has anyone ever heard of it? But so anyway, it's like a map-based game where you go around and you encounter creatures and scenarios from myth, folklore, and local legend. And we've been working on it for the past, I guess, 4 or 5 years. But really, in earnest, we went into production 2 years ago, and we should be soft launching this winter. So my email's at the end of the thing at the presentation. So if anyone wants to test it, our office is like 2 blocks down the road, just across from the Chick-fil-A. But don't get me started on the Chick-fil-A. But yeah, so if you wanted to try it out, let me know. I can get into more details about it later. Yeah, so anyway, I design location-based games. And this is Paul. I didn't introduce him.
Hi.
Paul's been working with me for the past 10 years. He's a writer, so he's done a lot of the localization, a lot of the scripting, say, for like items, dialogue, and also the overall kind of lore.
So I think it's probably also just interesting to add that, yeah, the technology is maturing, and we're getting to a point now where it's a feasible construct, I think, whereas it wasn't so as recently.
Mm-hmm. And it's only getting better, and I can get into that in a couple slides. So basically, the real question to ask is why location? Why would anyone want to make a location-based game? And for me, that's obvious. I mean, I've always wanted to make location-based games, but really, one of the reasons, there's many reasons. One, you can get people outside, you can get people to be active. I find that with the digital age, technology doesn't actually bring us together. I mean, it does, but look what happens with social media and Instagram, things like that. It's not, I think people have never felt more alone before. And one of the things I really like about the possibility of location-based games are bringing people together. Another thing I really like about location-based games are the fact that it gets people outside, it gets people to walk around and move around. It gets people to explore, and I think deep down, all human beings are natural explorers. Also, it can be used as a tool to reconnect people with their surroundings, things that they might not know about, and yeah.
So I think, especially in our urban lifestyles where we tend to focus on getting from point A to point B, and that behavior is really encouraged, it's valuable to have a tool that helps you reconnect yourself with your environment and your surroundings, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, and every experience in our lives happens at a location, and sometimes we have deep, meaningful ties to locations, and they can actually have a deep significance to us. But right now, this slide was why smartphones, and that's basically because they're the dominant platform. Can I see a show of hands? Who has a smartphone? So see, it's pretty much everybody. 85% of Canadians have smartphones, and really we're starting to focus on smartphones that enable augmented reality. So yeah, we built a platform called Large. It stands for Location-Based Augmented Reality Gaming Engine, and that's what we're building on. I think AR is really amazing because right now it's still nascent technology, and it's, you'll have like a Squirtle just sort of kind of floating around, but things are getting a lot better. Once we move into mixed reality, where we actually have occlusion and where digital objects are actually more aware of their surroundings and respond to the surroundings, it'll be much better. But for now, for location-based games, I think that the only platform that really makes sense is the smartphone. And to give you an example, by 2022 worldwide, there should be 3.5 billion handsets. To put that in perspective, handsets that are AR enabled. To put that in perspective, like, does anyone know, like, the Switch just surpassed the Wii? Like, what's the best-selling console of all time? Does anyone know? Was it the PS2? Anyway, whatever. So let's just put in perspective. That's a lot of people. That's a huge potential audience. Anything else? So I wanted to give you a background on different types of location-based games. I think the first example would be like a treasure hunt or a scavenger hunt. And that's actually over there, that's an example of the oldest treasure map in existence, apparently. But we grow up wanting to go and seek out treasure. And I think it's sort of just, it's really deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness.
And encoded into our video game collective consciousness as well. The metaphor has always been there for treasure hunting, so it makes sense to try to extend that into the actual world.
So there are a lot of games that we do play in locations, say like hide and go seek, capture the flag. These are games that we play when we're kids, and we use our imaginations to transform playgrounds into pirate ships, ravines into like magical worlds. So that's kind of what I keep in mind when I'm trying to design these experiences. In the middle there, basically, does anyone know what letterboxing is? Okay, cool. Someone does. So letterboxing, basically, it's an example of an early location-based game that developed in England, I guess over 160 years ago. And initially, it was a person who was like an avid walker or hiker. He would leave a box at a really inaccessible location, and then people would drop off their business cards or whatever, and to show that they had been there and to prove that they'd been there. And basically, until 20 years ago, there were less than 100 examples of letterboxes around the world. But then the Smithsonian did an article about it, and since then, the community has really like blown up. But still, it's very discreet. Like, it's a very secretive type of game. So usually what it involves is there'll be a stamp in a box that's usually hand-carved by the person who created the letterbox. And you go to the box, you take out the stamp, you stamp your book, and there's also a book in there, and you're supposed to have your own stamp, and then you stamp the book. But yeah, there's actually about 40, according to like the letterboxing website, there's about 48 letterboxes in and around Toronto. I think the closest one would be at Allen Gardens, but and the nursery. But yeah, and it's really secretive. There's and a set of rules started emerging, and it's not a thing that was actually organized by. One thing I really like about location-based games these days are just sort of emergent behaviors that develop. Say, for example, in Pokemon Go, like they never really anticipated that people would play together in groups or that people would adopt specific behaviors. But with letterboxing, like different rules ended up evolving where there would be how clues would move from location to location. But anyway, I'm probably talking about it too much. Oh, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with Masquerade. Anyone? Okay, cool. So Masquerade was, I think it was written in 1973 by a British author, and basically what it was, he was challenged by his publisher to come up with a type of book that no one had ever written before. So basically, this is the book that set off what they call armchair treasure hunting, and it was just a series of paintings with clues, and the clues would lead to a location where he buried a treasure, so I guess it's kind of an example of how what I wanted to show is that in order to make location-based games, even though we live in a primarily digital era and we think of games as being digital, you don't have to make your game digitally. So if you want to make a location-based games, there are many different ways that you can approach it. And here's the, for better or worse, what we currently consider a location-based game or a location-based augmented reality game has largely been informed by the massive success of Pokemon Go. And for me, I was happy that it was so successful because before it came out, when I was telling people I was making location-based AR games, they thought I was crazy. After it came out, they're like, oh, that's already been done. And I was like, great, you know? So here's some other examples of games that have been fairly popular in the location-based mobile space. Parallel Kingdoms actually was tremendously popular, I guess 5 years ago. It had millions of users, but it kind of like dropped off. And it was like a fantasy type game where you would collect resources and conquer territory. Zombies Run is an example of a different type of location-based game because you'd be, basically it was like audio. You'd be running from zombies, they chase you. You'd run faster because the zombies would get you if you didn't run fast enough. And down there is an example. I didn't put Ingress up there, did I? Oh, well, that's because of Shadow Cities. Basically, this is going on record, who cares? So basically, Niantic kind of copied this idea from Shadow Cities. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but it was basically Ingress before Ingress. You have like these different factions, and even visually it looks like it. So, and here's a bunch of other games. As you'll notice, most of them are based off existing IP, and that seems to be a common trend too. So we wanted to sort of avoid that because, I mean, let's think about it. Like Ghostbusters World, I guess it kind of makes sense. Jurassic World Alive, I guess it makes sense. Walking Dead Our World, I don't know. It's just, it seems like people are basically just trying to grab the biggest IP they can and then try to shoehorn it into the Pokemon Go template.
And the thing that's really unfortunate about that is that in all of these games, as well as Pokemon Go, the location is secondary to the experience of playing the game. You know, your main focus is grabbing the Charizard or whatever it is that you need. But we wanted to find a way to make the actual location where things happen and meaningful things happen part of the experience in a more relevant way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like what he said. So I think the first thing when you're designing a location-based game is what is the story that you want to tell? Actually, this presentation is actually structured in a series of questions because I don't have the answers. These are questions you're going to have to ask yourselves if you want to make location-based games. So what's the story you want to tell? And let's get into that. Do you want the story to be linear or freeform? And basically, for example, a walking tour is generally a linear experience, and I think that's an example of a location-based game, even though it's not usually that interactive. So does a person have to go from A to B to C to D to E? Or can they basically just wander and explore? You know what I mean? It's like games that are, but when it comes to, I know that everyone's considered this when you're designing like purely digital games, but when there are unique problems posed by this in the real world. For example, how far apart will your, our internal languages, we call them nodes, or where you have encounters. So how far apart your nodes? Like how do you calculate how long does it take a person to get from point A to point B to point C to point D? And then also, how long should the overall experience be? So really when you're thinking about it, when you're thinking about these games, you have to think about them in terms of space and in terms of the space that the game inhabits. Also, this is beyond space, it's also in terms of the story. Do you know what I mean? Like, is it something that's more like exploratory, where there are just a bunch of clues or little vignettes? For example, we're working on a thing that's kind of like an audio experience in Trinity Bellwoods, where it's location aware, and by walking through different zones, it'll trigger different sort of audio clips. And it's just, and that's not exactly a game, but it's an example of how you can really just sort of create like zones that overlap and have your narrative kind of flesh itself out. And it would be different each time for each user. Yeah, and so that's when we get into sort of scale. Like what scale makes sense? It's a lot easier to do something, say just in your neighborhood, than it is to do something on a global scale. Even though there are tools for you to make things on a global scale, and I'll get to them that's my last slide, like what tools are available for you. So say if you wanted to do like a game that just took place in like Kensington Market, or just in, you know, like it's easier to do something that's more confined. And that may seem like common sense, but yeah. But at the same time, you could make something global scale fairly easily.
Just to add that making stuff on a hyper-local scale is especially a good idea for creators because nobody knows your local space like you do. So you can infuse it with all kinds of layers of meaning and alternative arrangements and tasks to complete that are specific to your knowledge, as opposed to something that's more generic.
Yeah. And it's also important to think about how people will interact with your game, because this will inform a lot of your decisions in terms of the story. And the interactions should tie into, like, you know, how the story works and how your narrative works. So here's some examples of, I just wanted to go from like one side to the other. Like on the left, there's Murmur. That was a Toronto-based project. Does anyone remember that? So cool, that's good. So basically what it was a series of plaques with a phone number at a location. And if you went to that location, you called the number, you'd hear a story about someone's personal experience that happened to them at that location. This was actually what really got me into location-based games. And I ended up starting my first kick at the can in location-based games was with one of the people that co-founded Murmur, a guy named Gabe Sawney. So he worked on Echelon together. But I really liked that idea. For me, it was just, wow, we've got phones now, we can experience things in public places. But just in terms of interaction, this is basically, what's the interaction? Do you know what I mean? You're not really interacting or affecting what happens with that experience at that point. But, well, hello there. And the middle example is like basically Pokemon Go, not Pokemon Go, Harry Potter Wizards Unite, where you have to like basically trace a spell sign. And then you've got Dragon Quest Walk, which has been, I don't know if anyone knows about this yet. It hasn't been launched here, and I don't even know if they will, but it's been like tremendously popular in Japan. It's making a lot of money. I haven't played it yet though, but anyway, so how do people interact? Could it be with a quiz? There's lots of different interactions you can possibly put in. But that's really up to you. Oh, and here's one thing that's really important. How do you connect to location in meaningful ways? Meaningful ways. How do you connect to location in meaningful ways? And that's really what the crux of it is. Oh, really? Okay, wow. Okay, so for example, there are a lot of different ways you can connect with your location. There's the venues around you, the terrain, landmarks, weather, and there's also temporal factors, because no matter where I am at that given time, it's a time of day, there's a date, there's also lunar cycle, and weather. So, for example, in our game Sigil, creatures will only appear in certain weather conditions, like werewolves only appear when there's a full moon. Certain things only appear at like midnight on a specific day of the week. Things will only appear when they're by rivers or by streams or in parks. And say certain shrines will only appear at hospitals or in graveyards. So there's a lot of ways that you can connect your story or narrative to actual physical locations. Problems and limitations with location-based games I wanted to get into, because there are quite a few of them. The first one I'll say is battery life, and you may have noticed a lot of people that were playing location-based AR games would actually have secondary batteries or secondary phones. Hopefully that improves, but especially when you're using the rear-facing camera and GPS, it really drains the battery and your phones can actually overheat. There's also weather. When you're designing a game, especially in Canada, it's cold, right? So you don't really want to have a location-based game here. Doesn't make a lot of sense in the middle of the winter, unless that's what it's about. I guess it could be called hypothermia Go or something like that. Other problems are Wi-Fi and data, because people need to be connected all the time. That's not a problem in a place like Japan, where you can be on the subway and use the internet. But here, there's a lot of locations where, especially GPS, just shits the bed, for lack of a better word. I don't see many kids here. But yeah, like right now with the game that we're developing, you'll even see that the compass is effed up. Like you'll have 3 phones and they're all pointing in different directions, and you shake them around and you're like, who knows? I have a feeling that Apple is intentionally trying to sabotage phones, but you know, that could be a conspiracy theory. Yeah, and so the next slide is, well, who's your audience? Because this is really important too. Like, you've got to really, really think about it. Here I was going to actually go into some target demographics for who basically uses these games, but I don't think that's necessary because I'm running out of time. And here are tools that you can use to make a game like this. I would recommend Mapbox, or looking into Mapbox. Basically, you probably would be building this game in Unity. There's also, like, for example, Google Maps has 100 million different venue types around the world Google Places that you can tie into your game. Niantic, who made Pokemon Go and Harry Potter Wizards Unite and Ingress, they're working on a platform, but it's not really publicly available. Actually, and then there's Foursquare, which is actually interesting because they do have a very robust location. What do they call them? Like a database of location, venues, and types. Isn't about my time? Oh, okay. So, yeah, but if anyone has any questions, you can always call me. I'm just down the street. Well, you can't call me, you can email me. But I'm just down the street, and I'll answer any of your questions. I've been working on this stuff for a long time, and I think I was trying to cram too much into this presentation. I thought 30 minutes was a really long time, but it's not apparently.
So just let me say one sort of pretentious thing in summation. We think it's always a good idea for you to think about location in different ways, especially now that you're enabled with a tool like a smartphone that seamlessly and autonomously gathers all types of data, not stuff that you're necessarily conscious of, but data from many different types of sources. So I think it's worthwhile to start thinking about different ways that you can think about location. It's not just a point on a map. It's the memories that are associated with it. It's the emotions that are associated with it. It's the places that are around you and how they affect you.
Oh, that's a good point too, because a lot of locations have a very deep history, and it's interesting to be able to tie into that.
So just something to think about.
Also personal history. Yeah, I guess that's it. I'll be around if anyone has any questions. Thanks.